So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. There's two things that we want to talk about in this video. It might lead into a few more things, but we want to talk about what science is and what science isn't, and we're going to talk about why we're talking about this in the first place. And Kelley, why don't you tell us, give us maybe a brief explanation of what science is, like what you define as science, and why actual scientific endeavors and information is important.
First of all, we're going to be focused on data science. Like if statistical analysis is involved, that's what we're going to be focused on. Like a lot of physics experiments, when you're measuring the speed of light or something, there's no data points. You don't perform statistical analysis. In those cases, what you do, as a really brief explanation, you have some sort of initial measurements, and you have an error associated with those, and you propagate those until your final measurement. Now, when it comes to data, you don't necessarily have to do that. You kind of assume that most of your variation in your measurement is going to be within the data, within the variation of the data itself. That's why when you conduct statistical analysis, when you are gathering data, you want to isolate variables as much as possible, but that's really complicated. Let's keep it really simple. I think that probably the best thing to do is actually go into an example of an unscientific article. And this is an incredibly interesting example because this article is used to justify extremely authoritarian measures. And these authoritarian measures are things that everyone is already interested in right now. They just don't know enough of the details to attack it. Which is like online censorship and other manipulation campaigns. But anyway, the article. A very powerful organization that we'll get into later. They worked with the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It was established by Congress in 1968 as a link between the scholarly world and the policy world, which essentially means that they're politicized academics, or they're academics that work with politicians, political parties. So anyway, I don't know if the entire organization is ideologically corrupt or not. I have no proof of that, but I do have proof that there are certain authors in the organization that are. So they produced this article for this powerful organization that everyone should be talking about, but is not. And in this article, which specifically mentioned the organization and is important enough to this organization that they have it listed on their resources page on their site. So the article was a study. They call it a study. And what they did was they took data from social media sites, various social media sites, hundreds of thousands, around 300 plus thousand data points, and what they did with what they were collecting was hate speech directed at left-leaning female political figures. They were particularly interested in misogynistic hate speech. So now, first of all, they went into they had it broken up into two sections for the most part: a qualitative approach and a quantitative approach. And for those that don't know, a qualitative approach is anecdotal evidence. There's a time and place for it, normally in like sociology and psychology, but it always should be implemented. It should always complement a quantitative approach, which is empirical. That's data. So I skipped the qualitative nonsense, and I focused on the 16 or so pages of qualitative analysis. Now, this is where I'm going to simplify things down. The qualitative analysis is not actually qualitative analysis in this article. All it is data collection. Now, it's 16 pages of how they collected data, and there are some good things that they did, but for the most part, their methods were pretty primitive, and they could definitely have used some more rigorous oversight in their methods. But if you wanted to take data collection and turn that into a science report, then what you have to do is you have to have a standard, because simply collecting data is not a measurement. What you would want to do, what I would suggest to them if I was going to participate in a study, I would have a standard to measure that against. For instance, they were interested in users. They actually weren't even interested in users. They were interested in individual posts from users. So some users may have had 5,000 posts for just one, and that counted to the entire data set instead of counting individual users, which would probably be more useful. I would have made that change, but otherwise, I would have taken a standard where you would look at all posts that mentioned those figures that they were interested in, and the hateful ones and the non-hateful ones, and then you could actually get a measurement of the difference between the two, or a portion that this is of the whole. And now you have a measurement, and now you're one step closer to being science, but you're not science yet, because a measurement by itself is highly arbitrary. It can mean anything. And I explained this to you earlier today, and I think you really liked my explanation. So I'm going to explain why error analysis is so important, and it's not complicated. This is not a complicated thing. Anytime you make a measurement, it could be a really simple measurement, like with your tape measure. You never actually know what that measurement is, the true measurement. All you can do is hone it down. And so if you're particularly rigorous, when you make a measurement, you have an error associated with it. So you don't say my measurement is like 10 inches, you say, or 10 centimeters. You instead say my measurement is 10 centimeters plus or minus 0.005 centimeters. So this is my measurement, not this. It's not this specific point, it's this. And in statistical analysis, almost everything that we measure is a difference or a proportion between two measurements, something we're interested in, and a standard that we're going to judge it by. And so what you do is, the reason that this is why error analysis is so important. So this is what we're interested in, right? And this is the standard. And we want to see if they're different from each other, or if they're the same measurement. If that error overlaps each other, because remember, if I say that this is my measurement, it means that the true measurement is somewhere in this bracket. And it can be somewhere in there. If those errors do not overlap, you can say these measurements are different, or that there's a difference between them. Otherwise, if there's an overlap in those error brackets, then you can't reasonably say that these two are different. And in fact, it could very well be the very opposite. The true measurement could fall all the way on this end of the spectrum, and this one, it could fall all the way in on this end of the spectrum. And so many people think that they're doing science, or think that they're reading science, and if there's not an error analysis attached to it of some sort, it's not science. It's simply not, because like your qualitative analysis, you can make your science mean absolutely anything. Not only did they not have an error analysis with their study, they didn't even have a standard to judge it by. It was just data collection, and it was purposefully meant to make a problem look worse than it actually was.
So what they could have done is they could have taken, say, make it up for, they had 100,000 instances of what they called hate speech. But one of the problems with that is that that's just a collection of what they considered to be hate speech.
Yes.
And from what you're saying is that there could be a wide-ranging, amount of usages of what they consider hate speech, all the way on the left of a graph, in that collection, or all the way on the right. But the actual amount of things that fall into a direct, discernible, definitional idea of what hate speech is much smaller than just their collection of what they assumed. So not all those 100,000 um, data collection points would actually be considered hate speech. But they say we collected 100,000, so it makes it seem like the entire group is engaging in hate speech.
Well, they did make some like haphazard attempts to make their report seem more credible. For instance, like one thing that they did, they tried to correct for false positives. So one of the words that they were interested in was bitch, but some users they found were using it as a term of endearment. Like for instance, one of those political figures was Kamala Harris, and so they tried to correct for the false positives in which like. The cases where a user was using a slang term like that as a term of endearment, they tried to exclude that from the data. Yeah, they had these moments where they did seem like they were trying to be impartial, but there was so much more that they could have done. So much more that they could have done. They ended up having this data set that's I don't remember the number. I wrote this article a while back now. But it's around 300,000 data points. Interestingly, I don't know if this is going off topic, but they actually mentioned Project Veritas as well. And their introduction, they were talking about deliberate misinformation campaigns and more of spontaneous ones. And they were, as an example of something that's more deliberate, they actually use Project Veritas. And as far as undercover journalist organizations go, they have some of the best reputations that we know of as far as retractions go.
So let's talk about the initial data set, because that seems to be another issue, is when they're collecting information for a scientific study, as they put it, and they're dividing up into qualitative and quantitative. Also, that a lot of that falls, under, is it actually hate speech as defined by them, or hate speech as defined by society?
It is defined by them.
Mm-hmm.
It is defined by this organization. They define these terms beforehand. They did have a glossary of terms, I believe, but they were obviously using algorithms. Algorithms most likely implemented by the same organizations that censor you, the same organizations that redirect you. I don't know if your channel's ever talked about the redirect method, otherwise known as the redirect initiative. Probably not. Very, very few people have actually spoken about it. So these same algorithms that were developed by the CVE organizations were used in this study. Ironically, there's a conflict of interest here. They are using their own tools to justify the use of those tools, and they're essentially, they've developed techniques, and they are using those techniques and big names like the Wilson Center to justify. They're not just justifying their methods. They're not just justifying their existence. They're justifying the expansion of their methods onto networks that they don't have their thumb under. It's profound what's going on and how long it's been going on without people, without being in the spotlight.
And so one of the ways that they justify their expansion or some of their tactics would be they would use something like this supposed data analysis and scientific study to bolster their claims, to say, well, see, we have all this scientific evidence and information that we've provided, and we have all this hate speech, and so now we are justified in going in and using these tactics and these algorithms and all of this hardware and software that we've devised. So it's kind of a circular argument. They're making up things in order to bolster their actions and claims to then further make up more claims and to then go forward and forward. But all the while, they're kind of setting the terms and definitions and making them think kind of on the fly. Like,
they have created that's what you're getting to, right? A feedback loop. They have created a feedback loop where every technique that they develop, they use to further justify their methods. They're not actually good at this. They're actually very, very bad at this. And let's go ahead and name them. Why not?
Yeah.
The two most prominent ones are Moonshot CVE, although they've gotten rid of the CV out of their name. And then there's Jigsaw. And Jigsaw is a special case because, well, before we get into this, this is extremely valuable information I'm about to give you, and it's the basics of how online manipulation works. And despite a very prominent conservative movement against big tech censorship, in which case these conservatives are ironically calling this the awakening, the Great Awakening. I say ironic because they've uncovered no real facts, and they're using big tech platforms as the scapegoats. So in these campaigns that conservatives are focused about, the way that they actually work is pretty simple. There's three groups. The first group are the CVEs, combating violent extremism. We can talk some other time about how they came about and why that's in their title. And so this first group, they develop the techniques, the AI, the algorithms that are going to manipulate you in some way. And then there's the second group, the platforms. They host those techniques. And this isn't just confined to social media. This is on browser and general search and browser search, like Google and Bing. I have pinpointed that it's been used on both of those. Obviously, we should have mentioned that Jigsaw is owned by Google. Jigsaw is a division of Google. That's why I said Jigsaw is a very strange outlier in this, because they actually fall into the first and the second group, technically, because they're owned by Google, and Google is a platform. The third group is the manipulating agents. They look like psychology journals. They sometimes look like sociology or criminology reports, mental health organizations, or humanitarian efforts to help victims of violence. They're often disguised as these things, but they're highly unscientific, and they don't really have any real credibility. And this third group, by the way, this is the group that you'll get redirected to without your knowledge or consent. And these redirect campaigns can be very subtle. For instance, this third group can show up as like this organic ad result in your Facebook feed. A very specific example is the Life After Hate group. They were they were a group that was showing up in certain users, not every user, certain users showing up as an ad in their feed. And this is a left-leaning group that actually teaches users to not debate. That they teach them that debate is escalation, discussion is escalation. You know, imagine that. And they teach users how to censor content that they don't like on various platforms. So they're teaching users how to be bigots and how to be censors. And the users that are getting redirected to them are the users that are profiled. They're identified and are profiled by these CVEs and these platforms, and they're profiled into these cohorts, these certain groups online. And depending on the cohort that they're in, they're going to get redirected in a specific way. They're going to have certain content show up. There's even specific examples, like on YouTube. If you type in something specific, you might get redirected to the very opposite thing. By the way, it's very important to point out that the CVE organizations work very closely with, well, I don't know about very closely, I don't know if that'd be correct to say, but they work with intelligence agencies. They do produce reports for the Big Five, which is a conglomerate of intelligence agencies from 5 countries: the US, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. And then they also produce reports for themselves on their sites to justify these things, and to justify it to the tech platforms, because they want the tech platforms to host their campaigns. And even let's say someone came around and examined the Uniform Crime Reporting Program's data. This is like over 6,000 organizations across the U.S. and they pull their data in, and they conduct rudimentary analysis on. It's pretty good data. Let's say someone were to find that data and discover that hate crimes, which white supremacy would fall under. Let's say this person discovered that hate crimes were very insignificant in comparison to violent crimes as a total. What would you do with that? What would you do with that information? And imagine the people who get censored for criticizing the tech platforms. Imagine what happens to the person who criticizes the CVEs. They're not going to want to hear any arguments like that because they would no longer be able to even justify their existence, much less expansion of their campaigns. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a whole lot to take in. How many years now have people been talking about tech censorship? And no one has mentioned Moonshot. No one has mentioned Jigsaw. These are the pioneers in these movements. And Life After Hate, the Sofon Center, and so many others. No one investigates this.
Yeah, it's interesting. But then they also make connections to scientific or prestigious institutions like the Woodrow Wilson Center, which would, put forth accolades or perhaps even, scientific endeavors or awards in other areas that may prove to be scientific. They may have done other things that have been very scientific in nature and have data analysis and have things like that, but then they borrow their credibility in order to support their false understanding of science and how to collect data and put that forth. So it's pretty much it's almost like they're making an argument from authority.
Yes, they do. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. This is exactly what they're doing. They're targeting people, those types of people that they like to claim that they are lovers of science, but don't know what science is. The moment that you put someone in front of this group that appears to be a scientific group or a scientific person, they're going to open their ear, especially if what this expert says aligns with their beliefs. And so that's why all of these CVEs and tech platforms are redirecting people to leftist propaganda, because it doesn't work on a skeptic. It doesn't work on someone who even conservatives, and I mean, I've been spending a lot of time in this group. They're not scientific. They're more scientific than liberals because they have a more open mind about what a fact means. But they're very scientifically illiterate, and it doesn't work on this group because even though they are scientifically illiterate, they don't necessarily politicize the word science the way that left-leaning individuals do, and so they're a lot less susceptible. Some people believe, I'm one of these people, that there is a selection bias that happens naturally in our society, and the selection bias, it manifests itself as organizations that target people who prioritize feelings over thinking. And what happens when you do something like that is you get all of those people, that traffic coming into these outlets, and you end up with a group that's going to be very opposed to everyone else because they prioritize their feelings over thinking, and they make themselves more susceptible to manipulation, especially unscientific, disguised as scientific manipulation campaigns. And this actually might be what we're seeing with liberals and conservatives, that leftists and liberals are not the same thing. Leftists are most likely manipulating liberals because they know what they care about, or they know what liberals think they care about. And it's not something, like I said, it's just not something that works on certain people, but it works well enough that for several years now, we've had, for instance, we've had dozens, at the very least, psychology journals popping up on multiple platforms, pushing narratives that are actually antithetical to the psychology of trauma and resilience. If you could create an organization, they would have tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of followers. And this organization was spewing out bad psychology to these people. This could be very unhealthy for a nation.
It's interesting. Something you said kind of made me think, where you said that it seems like conservatives are a little more scientific, or at least they're open to a little bit more of the scientific method. I wonder if that's because of an inadvertent exposure to data analysis. So what I mean by that, it got me thinking specifically about all the claims, over, especially since George Floyd, and his death, about the shootings of black people, right? And how the left and all the media outlets were saying there's, this mass war on black people, and, black people are being hunted down by police officers and all that. And it seems like in a way that inadvertently triggered the right to then look at some statistics and say, okay, I heard even conservative YouTubers talking about, okay, well, let's look at, how many police shootings there are per year. Well, how many white shootings are there? How many black shootings are there? Well, what percentage of black men, out of the black population are being shot? And in some instances throughout the years, it was shown that there were more white people,
Yes.
like per capita or statistically were shot by police than black people were. So I wonder if there's like an inadvertent exposure to a bit of the scientific method just because of...
There's much more rigor.
Yeah.
There is much more rigor on that side. With certain things. The conservative movement has, we won't get into it today, but the conservative movement has some enormous holes, gaps in their knowledge. Some pretty significant things, and not even just with manipulation campaigns, but outside of them, online manipulation campaigns, but outside of them, and things that are going to have to be addressed sooner rather than later. But you were bringing up anecdotal evidence and using anecdotal evidence to manipulate liberals. And this is exactly what these CVEs do. And in fact, Jigsaw, I urge people to go to Jigsaw's site and to just look at it. It's very creepy. It's a beautiful site, but it's a very creepy site. And they justify all of their methods with 35 individuals. They call them formers. They're former white supremacists. And with just 35 data points, they're justifying Google's expansion onto new networks that they don't have censorship on yet, and not just censorship, but tracking and profiling and long-term data collection. And by the way, these long-term data collection campaigns have been going on for a while. They include a lot of things that you may not have suspected. For instance, like relationship maps. So you're identified by maybe a little bit more than half a dozen device fingerprints, and as well as your browser fingerprint. And even if these technology companies don't have your name attached to them, they're able to uniquely point out to the specific user, and it's you, among millions, with impunity. They're able to point you out, and they're able to point out other users that you interact with, and they're creating relationship maps, and they're storing that long term in their servers. They're storing geolocation data long term in their servers. So if you had your phone on you a year ago today, they may actually know exactly where you went and how long you were there, and who you interacted with, who you were near. And security state agencies can subpoena them for that information at any time.
That may be a topic for further discussion.
Yeah,
because we could run down that all day. But
I feel like we digressed a lot, but that's okay. That's okay.
But it is necessary, because obviously everything is connected in some way. So you can't. It's hard to just speak on one subject solely without obviously running down rabbit holes and stuff. But I think this was important, especially for my audience, because obviously my audience is conservative, mostly Christian, and for most of them, and even for me, until we've had discussions like this, this idea of extreme scientific rigor and data analysis, and just these ideas and these terms and these thoughts and the way that things are structured like this, is typically not something we come across. Like, we may see something and think, it seems kind of fishy, but you may not understand why.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, people should go to my Ghost page,
yes,
and they should read my articles. and browse through every single citation of every single article. Just get comfortable looking at these organizations. A lot of them have, as you've recently discovered, a lot of them have pages on their own Twitter pages, LinkedIn. Some of them have, a lot of them have Facebook pages. People need to pressure them. Go online, harass them, harass their pages, pressure politicians. Start talking about the real organizations that are involved. These organizations that are causing this massive spike in unscientific studies, unscientific, politically motivated studies. It's becoming a very big problem. It's been